She had a cross carved into her back. Rancher prayed beside her every night. The lamp was low the first time I knelt. I didn't plan it. I'd brought the water in same as every night that week, set the tin bowl on the crate beside the bed, wrung out the cloth, laid it across the back of her neck the way the doctor had shown me. And then I just didn't stand back up. My knees hit the floorboards and I stayed there. Don't know how long. Long enough that the lamp sputtered once and I thought it was going out, and I realized I was holding my breath waiting to see if it would catch again. It caught. I got up, walked out, closed the door behind me. That was the first night. I'll back up some, because there are things you need to know about the country out there, and about the kind of man I was before any of this happened, or none of it will make sense to you. The ranch sat in a long, flat valley in the territory, maybe 40 miles south of the military post at the top of the canyon. When I say flat, I mean the kind of flat that feels like something was taken away, like the land used to have more to it, and someone leveled it down to almost nothing and forgot to tell you what used to be there. There was a ridge to the west that turned the color of old copper at sunset, and a dry creek bed that ran water maybe 3 weeks out of the year, and cottonwoods along it that stayed green when everything else went to dust. The house was adobe and wood. 2 rooms, a lean-to kitchen I'd added the second year. I'd built it for a woman who didn't come, but that's a different story, and not one I want to get into here except to say I'd been alone on that land for 11 years by the time any of this happened. 11 years is long enough that a man stops noticing the quiet. It becomes just the texture of things. You go to town, the noise bothers you. You come home, the silence fits like a coat you've worn to the shape of yourself. I ran cattle, a few hundred head. I had a man named Custis who came 3 days a week and kept to himself, which I appreciated. I kept a vegetable patch off the south wall that produced more squash than any man alone had reason for. I had a dog named Fletcher who died the winter before this, and I had not replaced him, which is something I thought about sometimes, the empty spot where he used to sleep by the door. I did not go to church. I want to be plain about that because it matters. I had nothing against God in particular. I just had no relationship with him that I was aware of, and I was not a man who maintained relationships I didn't believe in. The minister in town, Haverford, a decent man, had stopped asking me to services sometime around year 3. We had a cordial understanding. I am telling you this so you understand that when I knelt beside that bed, it was not a habit. It was not something I did. It was something that happened to me, and I spent a good while afterward trying to figure out what it meant, and I'm not sure I ever fully did. She came in on a Tuesday in July. I know it was Tuesday because Custis had been out that morning, and he only came Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. I remember watching his wagon go back up the road and thinking the fence on the north pasture needed another day's work, but I'd leave it till Thursday, and then I turned back toward the house and saw her. She was on the ground at the corner of the corral. I hadn't heard a horse, hadn't heard anything. She was just there in the dust, face down, not moving. My first thought, and I'm not proud of it, was that she was dead. I stood there maybe 10 full seconds just watching her, the way you watch something you're not sure of, before I walked over. She wasn't dead. Her fingers moved when I got close, just a small curl, like she heard my boots in the dirt and was trying to make herself smaller. That undid something in me, the trying to be smaller. I crouched down and said I wasn't going to hurt her, which is maybe the most useless thing a man can say to a woman on the ground, but it was all I had. I couldn't see her face. Her hair was loose and matted, and she had her arms pulled up under her like she'd been trying to crawl and stopped. She had no shoes. Her dress was torn at the back from the shoulder to below the waist, and what was under the torn cloth, I didn't fully understand what I was seeing at first. The skin had been cut, not from a fall, not from brush, cut deliberate. The wounds were a few days old, the edges dark, the skin around them swollen in the heat. I said again, said it quietly, that I wasn't going to hurt her. Then I put my hands under her, careful as I knew how, and I picked her up. She weighed almost nothing. That was the thing that hit me first, how little she weighed, like something essential had already been taken out of her. She didn't fight me. She turned her face against my chest and made a sound that wasn't quite a word in any language I knew, and I carried her inside. The doctor was a man named Aldous Prout, who ran a practice out of a room behind the hardware store in Canaan Wells, which was the nearest town, 14 miles. I sent word with the Vasquez boy who sometimes carried my mail, paid him $2 to ride hard and come back with Prout before dark. Prout came. He was a small man with precise hands and a manner that gave nothing away, which I'd always respected about him. He examined her for a long time. I waited outside on the porch and smoked a cigarette I rolled badly because my hands weren't right. When he came out, he stood beside me for a moment and looked at the ridge. He said she'd live if infection didn't take her. He said she was dehydrated and had lost blood, and the cuts on her back needed to be cleaned twice a day and kept from the sun and air. He said there were other injuries he didn't go into, and I didn't ask him to. He said she'd been through something that would take a long time to come back from, if she came back from it. I asked if she'd told him anything about herself. He said she hadn't spoken at all. He said he thought she understood English, but he wasn't certain. I asked him what to do. He showed me the cleaning, the cloth, the carbolic solution he left in a brown bottle, the way to apply the dressing without putting pressure on the wounds. He was patient about it. I made him show me twice because I wanted to do it right. When he left, he looked at me in a way that wasn't quite a question. I told him I'd look after her. He nodded and climbed onto his horse and went back down the road. She slept for most of the first 3 days. I'd go in, do what Pruitt had shown me, try to get water into her. She took the water. The first time she opened her eyes and saw me standing over her, she went very still, and I saw her decide something. I don't know what exactly, but there was a decision in her eyes, a kind of settling, and then she closed them again. I slept on the floor of the main room. It wasn't comfortable. I didn't care. I'd had a cot in the linta that I dragged in, and I lay there at night listening to her breathe through the wall. When the breathing changed, I'd get up. Most times it was just the shift of sleep, nothing wrong. Twice in that first week she had not nightmares exactly, more like she'd get caught somewhere in the middle of sleep and couldn't move and couldn't come out of it. And she'd make a low, tight sound like something being compressed. Both times I went in and I said her name, or the name I'd given her in my head. I didn't know her name yet. I'll get to that. And said she was all right. She was at the ranch. Nobody was going to touch her. And both times the sound stopped and she went back down. The third night was when I first knelt. I don't know why I did it that particular night. The third night was quieter than the first two. She was more stable. Pruitt had said so when he came back to check. I had no reason to be afraid. I brought the water in, changed the dressing on her back. She was face down on the mattress, the way she slept most of that first week, because she couldn't bear weight on her back, and when I was done, I just stayed. Knelt. My hands were in my lap, and I didn't say anything, not even in my head. I just stayed beside her in the dark while she slept. When I got up, my knees ached. I was 54 years old and had no business on bare floorboards. I noted that and went to bed anyway. The next night, I did it again. On the 5th day, she told me her name. I'd come in with breakfast, eggs, and some of the squash cooked soft, because she needed to eat and chewing anything hard was beyond her, and set it on the crate. I was turning to go when she said it. Myra. I stopped, turned back. She was looking at me with those eyes that had the decision in them. Dark eyes, very clear. She looked older than she probably was, which happened to people in hard country, and she was watching me with a kind of careful attention, like she was reading something in my face. I said my name, Corbett, Tom Corbett. She nodded once, like she was filing it away. I said she didn't have to tell me anything she didn't want to tell me. She said she knew. Then she looked at the plate and I watched her make the decision to eat, which took some courage just then, I think. I went out and let her. She was Apache, or half her mother, she told me weeks later when she talked more. Her father had been a man from Santa Fe, a merchant, who died when she was small. She'd grown up in the space between things, which I understood even before she said it in those words, because I recognized it in how she held herself. The watching, the measuring, the way she moved through a room, not quite fitting anywhere. Learning to be very still and very observant as compensation for that. It was a different kind of alone from mine, but I knew alone when I saw it. She'd been at the military post for 2 years, working as a laundress and interpreter, one of several women who did that kind of work up there. She had a way with language, spoke 3 things fluently, English and Apache and some Spanish, and the officers used her when there was a reason to talk to anyone outside the post. She was good at it. She told me once later that she'd learned to make herself useful to people who might otherwise have found her inconvenient, and that this had kept her safe for a long time. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact, the way you state the terms of a piece of land. She did not tell me in those early weeks what had happened to her back. I didn't ask. The wounds were what they were, and asking her to explain them seemed wrong in a way I couldn't quite put language to, like asking someone to describe a fire while they're still burned from it. Some things earn the right to be left in silence until the person who carries them decides to speak. What I knew was what I saw. Someone had taken a knife to her. Someone who knew how to use one and had taken their time because there was nothing hesitant or accidental in what was on her back. The shape of it, I saw it every day when I changed the dressing, and it settled into me gradually, the way certain things do when you see them enough times. Not a single shock, but a slow accumulation of weight. A cross. Not ragged, not the result of struggle or accident. Even, precise. The lines clean, the depth consistent. It had been done by someone who was careful about it. The first time I fully understood what I was looking at. I mean the first time I let myself know, rather than just noting it clinically as an injury requiring treatment. I had to put the cloth down and stand up and walk out to the porch for a minute. I stood there in the August heat with my hands at my sides, looking at the corral, the ridge, the sky, the ordinary things that were just going on. I thought about the kind of man who does that. Not in anger, the precision wasn't anger. In anger, you cut ragged. You cut in whatever direction your arm is moving. This had been done by a man who wanted something to last, who wanted to leave something that would still be there in 10 years, in 20, whenever she was seen without her shirt, who wanted her to carry his mark the way you brand cattle. I thought about where such a man had gone after, whether he was still up at the post, sleeping in a bunk, eating the army's food. I thought about what it meant that she'd gotten up from whatever had been done to her, and walked 40 miles in the July heat in her bare feet with no water to speak of, and had come off the road and found her way to the edge of my land and put herself down at the corner of my corral. There was something in that, in the 40 miles and the choosing of it, that was worth thinking about. She hadn't hidden. She hadn't stayed where she was. She'd walked. I stood there a while longer. Then I went back inside and finished the dressing. She got stronger in the second week. She sat up. She came one morning and stood in the doorway between the bedroom and the main room and looked at the kitchen. I asked if she wanted something. She said she was going to cook, and her tone of voice left very little room for discussion. I said all right. She made something with the dried beans and the dried chilies I had that I'd never have managed myself. I ate 2 plates of it, and she watched me eat with an expression I couldn't read. After that, she cooked most nights when she was able. I didn't ask her to. She wanted to, I think, or needed to, something to do with her hands, something to be useful. I understood that. We ate mostly in quiet, not uncomfortable quiet, just the quiet of 2 people who didn't have much habit with small talk. She'd say a thing when she had a thing to say, and I'd answer, and then we'd go back to eating. I found I didn't mind it. I found I looked forward to it, which surprised me. The nights were a different thing from the days. Nights, the thing that had happened to her came back into the house. I could feel it even from the other room, the way weather changes the feel of a place before it actually hits. She didn't always have the bad times in sleep. Sometimes she'd be awake for them. I'd hear her walking, just the sound of her feet on the boards, back and forth, not going anywhere, just moving. Those nights I would not go in unless she needed me to. She had enough people having done things to her without consent. But I'd lie on the cot and listen and be there, and sometimes I'd hear the walking stop and I'd think she'd gone back to sleep. And then I'd hear her voice, low, almost no volume, just the shape of words, and I understood after a while that she was talking to herself in Apache, working something through. I didn't understand a word of it. I didn't need to. My kneeling, I think, was my version of that, working something through. I'm not sure I was praying in any way a minister would recognize. I wasn't making requests. I wasn't confessing anything. I'd kneel there in the dark beside the bed, and something would go quiet in me that didn't go quiet any other way. I thought about her back, what I'd seen there, what had been done. And I thought about the land outside, the valley, the ridge, the particular way the stars sat over this part of the territory. And sometimes I thought about the years I'd been here alone, and how I hadn't minded them until I had something to compare them to. I thought about what I was willing to do if the man who'd done that to her ever came down this road. I'm not a violent man. I want to be clear about that. But there are things I would have done and been at peace with, and on some of those nights I let myself know that plainly, kneeling there in the dark, and there was something almost like prayer in it, the letting yourself know what you're made of. Custis found out about her on the second Thursday. He came in to work the fence, same as always. She was out at the vegetable patch when he arrived, picking the squash with a cloth hat I'd found in the bottom of a trunk, one of the few things I had from the woman I'd been waiting for 11 years back, a hat she'd never come to wear. She wore it without knowing that. Custis looked at me. I looked at Custis. He was a man of about 60 who'd seen considerable things in his life and who did not require explanations. He said, "She need anything from town." I thought about it. I said probably, and did he have room in the wagon? He said he had room. When she came in from the garden, and I told her Custis was going to town if there was something she needed, she went still for a moment in the way she did when she was deciding something. Then she said there were a few things and wrote them on a piece of paper I gave her, in a hand that was careful and small. Custis took the list without looking at it, folded it, put it in his pocket, and went out to the wagon. That was the whole of it. I've thought about that, about Custis just absorbing the situation and asking only what was practical and going on about his work, and I've thought it was one of the better things I'd seen a person do. Prout came back at the end of the second week to check the wounds. He looked at them a long time. Then he looked at me across the room and said they were healing well, said I'd done a good job with the dressings. Then he looked at her and told her directly that the scarring would be significant, but the infection risk was mostly past. She thanked him. There was a dignity in how she said it that I noticed. He packed up his bag and I walked him out to his horse. Before he got on, he stood there a moment with the reins in his hands. He said, "You know what that is? What's cut there?" I said I did. He said he'd heard of it being done up near the post. He didn't go further than that, but he looked at me in a way that told me he was adding things up. I asked if he'd told anyone she was here. He looked at me a long moment, said the people he treated stayed his business. I said I appreciated that. He mounted up and rode out, and I went back inside. She asked me one evening in the third week why I knelt. I'd thought she was asleep. It was past midnight, late enough that the frogs along the dry creek bed had gone quiet, which happened around that hour. I'd come in, done the check on the dressings, set the water down, and I was kneeling there in the dark with my hands in my lap when she said it. "Why do you do that?" Her voice was completely calm, not surprised, not accusing, just a question. I didn't have an immediate answer. I thought about lying, saying I was checking on something, looking at something on the floor, but she wasn't a person you lied to, not because she'd punish you for it, but because it seemed like a bad way to use the time she was giving you. I said I wasn't sure. I said it seemed like the thing to do. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you praying?" I said I honestly didn't know. She thought about that. She said in Apache a few words I didn't have, and then she said in English, "There's a word for what you're doing. It doesn't translate." I said, "What does it mean, roughly?" She said, "Keeping watch, but for something you can't see." I thought about that for a while, kneeling there. I said that sounded about right. She didn't say anything else. I stayed a while longer and then got up and went to bed. I need to tell you about Deacon now. His real name was Everett Mace. He went by Deacon because he'd been one somewhere back in his history before whatever had happened to whatever he'd been. He was a man who worked the territory between the post and the towns south of it, not military, not civilian exactly, doing whatever the officers wanted done that they didn't want to put in a report. There were men like him all through the territory in those years. Some of them were just scouts, useful men, nothing bad about them. Mace was not that kind. I'd seen him twice in town, once at the hardware, once at the saloon where I sometimes went on a Friday evening, and both times I'd had a feeling about him that I didn't have about most people. Not fear exactly. Recognition, maybe. Some men you can tell what they're capable of without them having to show you. He came down the road on a Thursday in August. 5 weeks after Myra had come off the road and put herself in the dust at my corral. I saw him from the porch. I was sitting there with coffee in the early morning when the shape of a rider came out of the tree line to the north. I had plenty of time to watch him come. I set the coffee down very carefully and went inside. She was in the kitchen. She looked at my face and went quiet. I said there was a rider coming. I said she should stay inside and let me talk to him. She looked at me for a moment. She said she wasn't going to hide. I said I didn't mean hide. I meant let me talk to him first. She looked at me another moment and then stepped back from the door. Mace came up to the yard and stopped his horse at the edge of it, which is the correct thing to do at a man's property. You stop at the edge and wait to be invited in. He knew that much. Men like him always know the forms. It's the substance they're missing. I stood on the porch and waited. Didn't come down to him. Let him be the one to close the distance if he wanted it closed. He was maybe 40, lean, with a face like the country. Not much on it that wasn't functional. He wore a cavalry-issue rifle on his back and a revolver on his hip. He had the eyes of a man who was always doing arithmetic, always calculating distance and cost, and what he could get away with and how quickly. I'd known a few men with eyes like that, and they were consistent in the things they were willing to do. He touched his hat brim when he got close enough, a gesture so practiced it meant nothing. Said good morning and told me his name and said he was looking for a woman who'd gone missing from the post about 5 weeks back. Half Apache woman. He described her age and height and coloring with the flat efficiency of a man describing livestock. And I listened to all of it and kept my face the way I kept it when I was doing business in town. Not closed exactly, just neutral. A man with nothing particular going on. I looked at him and said I hadn't seen anyone matching that description. He said he'd heard in town there was a woman at my place. I looked mildly curious, the way you do when someone's told you something incorrect. I said my housekeeper had been here going on 2 years, Mexican woman, Maria, 40 or so. Her husband used to work the Esterhazy spread before the Esterhazys sold. I said he was welcome to talk to her if he needed to, but she'd been here long as the fence. He looked at me. I looked at him. Not staring him down, nothing dramatic. I just looked at him the way I'd look at the ridge in the afternoon when the weather was changing, interested and easy, as though it had nothing to do with me. The arithmetic in his eyes was running. He said the woman from the post had marks on her back. Someone might have gotten her some medical attention. Doctor in these parts might have been called out. I said the doctor came out now, and then for this and that. Said I'd have to check with him about any of his patients, as that seemed like a private matter between a doctor and whoever he was tending. I said it the way you'd say something obvious to a reasonable man. He nodded slowly. Something shifted in his face, not the arithmetic exactly, but the calculation underneath it, running the odds, deciding how much to push and how much to save for later. He was smiling by then, just barely. The kind of smile a man uses when he wants you to know he's not fooled, when the smile is itself a message. I know you're lying, and we both know it, and the only question is what I do about it. He wore it comfortably, that smile. It was a well-used tool. I stood on my porch and let him have it. He said he'd appreciate it if I'd let him know if I heard anything. Said the woman had been employed at the post, and the officers there were concerned about her welfare. I said I could imagine they were. He looked at me a beat longer than necessary. That was the thing, a beat longer each time, just pressing on the edge of something to see if it gave. I gave him nothing to press on. I said I'd certainly keep my eyes open. He said he appreciated my cooperation. I said I was a cooperative man. He sat on that horse for another 10 seconds looking at me, and I looked back, easy as a summer morning. And then he turned the horse and rode back up toward the road at the same unhurried pace he'd come in. I watched him go. I watched the way he rode, the set of his shoulders, whether he looked back. He looked back once just before the tree line, and I was still on the porch, still easy, still nothing going on. He went through the trees. I stood there a full 2 minutes after he was gone, not moving, just making certain. Then I went inside. I told her what had happened, all of it plainly. She sat at the kitchen table and listened. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, and she was very still. When I was done, she said, "He'll come back." I said I knew. She said, "He did this." Not a question. I said I figured. She was quiet for a while. The kitchen was hot. Out the window the cottonwoods were moving in a small, dry wind. She said, "Why do you keep me here?" I looked at her. She said it again, not challenging, just asking the way she asked most things direct, because she didn't have use for the indirect. "Why do you keep me here? You could have sent me to town. You could have let him take me. You could have said, yes, she's here. It would have been simpler." I thought about what to say. I said because she'd come to my place and she was mine to look after. Said it that plain, she was mine to look after the same way the cattle were, the same way the land was. Not owned, entrusted. She looked at me for a long time with those clear eyes. Then she said something in Apache, quiet. I asked her what it meant. She said, "It means you're a good man." I said I was a man with a fence that needed work and a squash patch that was overproducing. She looked at me and then she laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh, and it hit me somewhere central, that laugh, the sheer surprise of it in that kitchen on that hot morning. I rode to Prout that afternoon. I told him about Mace, about what I'd said. I asked him directly to confirm, if anyone asked, that the woman at my place was a Mexican woman named Maria who had worked for me 2 years. Prout looked at me a long time. He said he didn't lie to military or government officials. I said I understood. I said I wasn't asking him to lie. I was asking him to say nothing about any patients, which was his right. He thought about that. He said that was different. I said I believed it was. He said he'd be seeing a patient tomorrow morning, and the appointment after that was Friday. He said he kept his schedule locked on those days and saw nobody who dropped in without notice. I said I appreciated that. I also stopped at the post office. I knew a man there, Gunnery Sergeant Aldridge, retired, who managed mail and also knew everything that moved through the territory. He had the mail postmaster job as a sinecure, somebody's favor to a 30-year man who'd earned one, and he spent the hours he wasn't sorting letters sitting outside his door in a Windsor chair watching the road, and he had been watching that road for 6 years, and he had a memory like a ledger. I spent 40 minutes with him, and a bottle of decent rye I'd brought from the house. His Windsor chair had a spare beside it that I think stayed there specifically for visitors who came with something to trade. What I learned, Mace had been working the territory for about 3 years, under arrangement with a colonel named Thorpe who'd come to the post 18 months back from a posting in New Mexico. Thorpe ran a tight operation, the kind of tight that comes from a man who's afraid of what gets loose if he isn't watching every seam. He had dealings with certain civilian interests, land interests mostly, men who saw the territory's future as something that needed to be cleared of inconveniences before it could be developed. And he used men like Mace for the clearing that couldn't go into any official report. Aldridge told me this quietly, not looking at me, watching the road, his hands around his cup. He said Mace wasn't the only one. Said Thorpe had 2 or 3 men doing similar work, none of them officially connected to the post in any way you could put on paper. I asked about Myra by description. He thought a moment. He said he knew the type of woman she'd been up there, interpreter, laundress, the kind of woman who became too fluent in the workings of a place for a careful man's comfort. Useful while contained, dangerous if she started talking to the wrong people. He said there'd been 2 others, women who'd been at the post and then weren't in the year before. He said it without elaborating, and the way he didn't elaborate told me what elaborating would have said. I sat with that a moment. I said I was going to need him to tell some of this to a marshal. He looked at me for the first time in 20 minutes. His eyes were the faded blue of a man who'd spent decades in bright sun. He said he'd waited a good while for someone to come around asking the right questions. I said I was asking. He said he'd talked to a marshal. He said it with the flat certainty of a retired sergeant committing to a thing, which meant it was done. I poured him another cup, and we sat a while longer watching the road. I rode home in the last of the daylight. I told her that night. She took it in without any expression I could name. When I was done, she nodded once, as though she'd already known the shape of it, only the specifics had been missing. She said, "What will you do?" I said I'd figured that out on the way home. I told her I was going to ride to the territorial marshal's office in Tucson, that it was 3 days' ride, but I had a case now. I had Prout, who'd seen the wounds and could describe them. I had Aldridge, who'd talk to a marshal if not to just anyone. I had her if she was willing to make a statement. She said she'd been told the law didn't cover women like her. I said the law was uneven, and I knew it. I said I was going to try anyway, because not trying seemed wrong to me, and if the marshal's office did nothing, I'd go to the territorial newspaper, and if the paper did nothing, I'd go to every retired officer I could find, and I'd make enough noise that Thorpe and Mace would spend the next decade looking at their choices. She looked at me. She said, "You could just leave it. He might not come back." I said he would come back. She said, "Then why not just wait, be ready?" I said because I wanted it on paper. I wanted her name on paper with what had been done to her in a record, Because a record meant something, even if the law was slow. It meant it happened. It meant she was a person it happened to. She was very quiet. Then she said, "No one has ever put my name in writing for a good reason." I said I was going to. We argued about whether she would come to Tucson or stay at the ranch. She wanted to come. I wanted her to stay because the ride was hard and her back was still healing and Mace was in the territory and the road north went past the post. I said all of that. She listened to all of it and then said she was coming, and the way she said it I knew the argument was over. We left before dawn on a Sunday, Custy staying to watch the cattle. I had the sorrel mare and a second horse for her, a steady gray I trusted, and we took the long way around, south through the foothills and then east before turning north, adding half a day but staying well off the main road. She rode well. Better than I expected, though I'm not sure why I was surprised by that. She rode quietly, economically, not wasting movement. The second day, when we were climbing into the foothills and the going was slow and the heat was something physical sitting on your shoulders, she rode alongside me and said nothing and I said nothing, and it was a companionable nothing, the kind that builds over time between two people in hard country. On the second night, camping in a draw off the main trail, I built a small fire and she sat across it from me with her knees up and her arms around them, looking at me through the flame. The draw blocked the wind and the fire was good. The stars over the territory on a clear night are something I've never been able to describe to anyone who hasn't seen them, and I won't try now. Suffice to say there were a lot of them and they were close. She'd been quiet most of the afternoons writing, not troubled quiet, just inside herself turning something. I'd learned the different kinds of her quiet by then. She said, "Why did you never leave this country?" I looked at her over the fire. I said I'd tried once, said it and didn't go further. She waited. She was very patient about waiting. Most people couldn't do it, they'd fill the silence. She let it sit there until it was comfortable, and then she let it sit a little longer. I said I had a woman I was supposed to marry, back in Missouri. Long time ago, I was 28, 29. We'd been together since we were young, the way people do in a place where everyone knows everyone and time moves slow. When I told her I was going west, she said she'd wait, and she meant it, or she thought she meant it. She was supposed to come out when I had the house built, when I had enough on the land to show her it would work and it would last. I built the house. I had enough. I wrote and told her so. She wrote back and said she'd found another man, a man who'd stayed near home, a man who didn't have territory dust in his blood and a ranch that might break any given year in a dry summer. Said she was sorry, said she hoped I'd understand. Said she thought I probably loved the land more than I'd ever loved her, and maybe she was right about that, and maybe that was what finally decided her. I'd understood mostly. That last part was true enough that I couldn't argue with it, but I'd stayed anyway. Not waiting for her, I wasn't fool enough for that, and besides, I'd understood. Just the territory by then was mine in a way Missouri wasn't anymore. I'd put 11 years into that ground. The house had my hands in it. The fence line knew my particular way of setting posts. You can't just walk away from that and have it mean nothing. Myra looked at me through the fire. She said, "You built the house for her and stayed in it alone." I said that was about the size of it. She was quiet for a while. The fire popped once and resettled. She said, "That takes either a great deal of stubbornness or a great deal of faith." I said, "Probably stubbornness." She almost smiled. "I'm not sure there's a difference." I thought about that. I said maybe faith was just stubbornness about something you couldn't see yet. She looked at me over the fire for a long moment. Then she said, "That's exactly what it is." We sat with that a while. The stars did their thing overhead. The horses shifted in the dark at the edge of the draw. After a while, I put more wood on, and we slept. We got to Tucson on the third afternoon. The marshal's office was a low building off the main square, with a deputy outside who looked at Myra in a way that made me put myself between them. Just a slight shift, nothing dramatic, just, "I'm here and you'll deal with me first." The marshal was a man named Caswell, maybe 55, heavyset, with the manner of a man who'd heard most things and was no longer surprised by them. I sat across from his desk and told him what I knew in order. I told him about Myra coming onto my land. I told him what I'd seen on her back. I told him what Prout had documented. I told him what Aldridge had told me about Thorpe and Mace and the others. He listened without interruption. When I was done, he looked at Myra, who was sitting beside me, straight-backed, hands in her lap, and he said, "Ma'am, do you want to give a statement?" She looked at him steadily. She told him what had happened. She told it plainly, without embellishment, without rage, in a voice that was flat and clear and left no room for doubt. She named Mace. She described what he'd done. She described being told it was a warning and what she was being warned about. She described the walk 40 miles barefoot in July because she knew if she stayed she would die there. Caswell's face through all of it was carefully neutral, but his hands were still on the desk in a way that told me he was holding something controlled. When she was done, he asked 2 clarifying questions, both precise, both relevant. Then he told us to stay in town. He told us it would take some time. He told us he'd need Pruitt's documentation and Aldridge's statement. He told us he was not going to promise us anything about Colonel Thorpe because military jurisdiction was complicated. He told us he was going to promise us Mace. He looked at Myra when he said that last part, not at me, at her. She nodded once. We stayed at a hotel near the square for 5 days. I took a room, she took the room next to it. The hotel was a decent one, not fancy but solid, adobe and timber, with a woman at the desk who looked at us with the measuring look of someone who ran a house and had opinions about who came into it. She looked at Myra and something moved in her face, a quick calculation, and then she looked at me and I looked back and didn't say anything, and after a moment she handed us the keys without a word. I respected her for that. The first night I lay in a real bed in a real room and looked at the ceiling. It was cooler than the ranch, the altitude doing that, and the ceiling was plaster and had a water stain in the shape of something I couldn't quite name. I thought about all the ways the next days could go wrong, and there were a number of them. Caswell might do nothing, or do something half-hearted, or Thorpe might have reached we hadn't accounted for. I went through them the way you go through a fence line in your head before winter, checking each post. Then I stopped, because I'd done what I could do up to that point, and the rest of it was going to happen, or it wasn't. I thought about Myra in the room next to mine, and whether she was sleeping. I doubted she was sleeping. On the second day, I went to the territorial newspaper. It was a small office on a side street. A man named Hartwell, maybe 35, who had ink on his hands and the slightly compressed manner of a person who'd seen too much and was still deciding what to do about it. I told him about the situation without names, hypothetically, and watched him lean forward on his desk as I talked. When I was done, he asked 3 questions, all of them good ones, and I told him I'd be in touch when I had more of the particulars sorted. He said he'd keep a file open. I told him I appreciated that. On the second night, there was a knock at my door around midnight. I opened it and she was standing in the hallway in the lamplight. She didn't look distressed, just awake. She said she couldn't sleep. I said I wasn't sleeping much either. She asked if she could sit. I opened the door wider and pulled the chair out from the desk, and she sat down, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and we sat there in the lamplight and talked for a couple of hours about things that had nothing to do with Mace or Thorpe or what we were waiting for. She told me about the territory when she was young, some of the places she'd been with her mother. I told her about Missouri, which I'd barely thought about in years, and found I could talk about it without the old tightness. Around 2 in the morning, she said, "You won't kneel tonight." I said I wouldn't need to, that it was a thing I did when she needed watching, and she didn't need watching right now. She looked at me. She said, "I think you need it more than I do." I thought about that. I said maybe I'd gotten into the habit. She said quietly, "I hope you keep it." I didn't know what to say to that. I sat there a moment, and then I did something I hadn't planned. I got off the bed and knelt on the floor of that hotel room in the lamplight with her watching, and I bowed my head and stayed there. She came off the chair and knelt beside me. We stayed like that a while. I could feel the warmth of her arm against mine, not touching exactly, just present, and outside the window Tucson was doing what it did at 2 in the morning, and inside the room something settled that had been unsettled in me for a very long time. More than 5 weeks. More than 11 years, maybe. We didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that needed saying. After a while we got up and she went back to her room, and I went back to my bed and slept better than I had in years. Caswell arrested Mace on the 4th day. He sent word to us at the hotel with a note that said simply, "He's in custody. Come by the office at your convenience." I read that, "at your convenience," 3 times. I think it was the most careful language I'd ever seen in a legal document. Myra read the note and then folded it and held it in her hands a moment. Then she said, "What about Thorpe?" I said Caswell had told us military jurisdiction was complicated. She said, "Does that mean nothing happens to him?" I said I didn't know. I said there were other things in motion. I'd spoken with a man from the territorial paper on the second day, quietly, without names, just describing the situation, and he'd been very interested. I said Aldridge's statement was already in Caswell's file. I said the record existed now, and records had a way of accumulating. She looked at me. She said that might not be enough. I said she was right. I said it might not be enough for Thorpe. I said Mace was enough for today, and tomorrow something more might move, and the day after something more might move again, and that was how this kind of thing usually went, slow and imperfect, and I didn't have better news than that for her. She was quiet. Then she said, "But my name is in it." I said it was. She said, "In writing, for a good reason." I said yes. She looked away, out the window at the square, at the dust and the afternoon light. We rode back to the ranch on a Friday. The long way around again. She rode beside me most of the way, the gray horse easy under her. She'd bought herself a few things in Tucson. I'd given her money without making anything of it, just handed it over in the morning of the second day and said I'd see her at supper. And when I came back, she had a canvas saddlebag and a change of clothes and a good wool blanket for the nights. She hadn't said thank you. She'd looked at me and nodded once in that way she had, and that was enough. The first day out of Tucson was the worst going. The road was rutted and the heat was sitting on the foothills, and the horses were fresh from the livery but not trail-happy. She rode without complaint. I stopped twice to check on her, on the back, because the dressings needed changing and the ride was hard work for wounds that hadn't fully finished healing. She sat still both times while I changed them, looking out at the scrub. Not impatient, not embarrassed. Just present with it. That was a thing I'd noticed about her early, how completely she was present with whatever was happening, not trying to be somewhere else. By the second day, the going was better, and the country was opening up, and we were into the long, slanted light of afternoon when we dropped down through the last of the foothills toward the valley. I'd been going through the practical list in my head most of the day. Whether Prout would be needed for further testimony, what Caswell might need from us as things moved forward, whether Thorpe had the kind of reach that would make problems on the road. I'm a man who does better with a list, with the things in order, the knowable things first and the unknowable set aside until they become knowable. I was not letting myself think about what came after the list. There were things on the other side of it that I didn't know how to approach, and I'm not a man who charges at things he isn't ready for. I've learned that about myself, not a virtue exactly, just a fact, and so I was staying with the list. The valley came into view below us, that flat expanse of it, the dry creek bed threading through the cottonwoods. She said on the afternoon of the second day, riding through the last scrub at the edge of the valley without preamble, "I'd like to stay." I looked at her. She was looking ahead, not at me. Her hands were easy on the reins. She said, if that would suit you." I said it would suit me. She nodded. I said there was work I could use help with, honestly. The vegetable patch had gotten ahead of me, and I needed to put up fencing on the north pasture before fall, and Custy's was reliable, but 3 days a week was all he could manage. She glanced at me then, with something at the corner of her mouth. She said, "You don't have to sell it to me." I said I wasn't selling anything. I was just being clear about the arrangement. She looked at me another moment. She said, "Tom," something about the way she said my name, just that, just the plain use of my name the first time she'd said it. I said, "Yeah." She said, "I know what the arrangement is." We came in off the road at dusk. The ranch sat in the last light, the adobe walls going the color of the ridge, the cottonwoods still, the dry creek bed picking up the sky. I'd been here 11 years, and I'd never looked at it quite the way I looked at it coming in that evening with her riding beside me. Custy's was closing up the corral when we came through the gate. He looked at us. He looked at the horses, then at me, then at her. He said, "Good trip." I said it had been. He said the north fence had held, and the cattle were settled, and he'd be back Tuesday. I said I'd see him Tuesday. He got on his wagon and went up the road. She dismounted and stood in the yard looking at the house. The lamp was on inside because Custy's had left it, and the light came through the window and laid a yellow square on the ground in front of the door. She said, "It's a good house." I said I'd built it myself. Said it without thinking, and then felt the old thing move in me, the story behind that, the woman, Missouri, the house built for someone who didn't come, and then I felt it settle. It was just a fact now. A house I'd built. It didn't have the same weight it used to. She turned and looked at me. She had the cloth hat on still, the one from the trunk. She'd worn it for most of the trip. In the lamplight from the window, she was looking at me with those clear, decided eyes, and I understood something about the deciding in them that I hadn't fully understood before. It wasn't just caution, the watching and deciding of a person who'd been hurt. It was also something else. It was a person who knew her own mind, who took her time, but once she decided, she was done renegotiating. She had decided something about me. I didn't know exactly when. Somewhere between the corral in Tucson and the hotel room in the lamplight, she decided something about me, and she was looking at me now with that decision settled in her face, and it was the most valuable thing anyone had looked at me with in a very long time. I walked over to her. I didn't say anything. I just stood there in front of her, and she reached up and put her hand against my jaw, not quite holding my face, just her palm against my jaw, warm from the writing. We stood there like that in the yard. After a while, I put my hand over hers. Hers was smaller than I expected, which was foolish. I'd held her hand plenty of times to help her those early weeks. But this was different, this holding, and the size of her hand against mine settled into me in some particular way, the exact weight and warmth of it. She said very quietly, "I saw you, out there on that porch when he came. I was watching from the window." I said I'd figured she was. She said, "You didn't look afraid." I said I was some. She shook her head just barely. She said, "No. You knew what you were and you stood there with it. That's not being unafraid, that's something else." I said I didn't know what to call it. She said in Apache, the same few words she'd said that first night I'd asked why I knelt, the word that didn't translate. I asked if she was calling me a watchman again. She looked at me, smiled, a real one, not the corner of the mouth one all the way, said something like that. We went inside. She made something with the dried beans again while I watered the horses, and I could smell it from the lean-to, that same smell from the first time she'd cooked, and it had become, I don't know how to say this exactly, it had become one of the smells of the place. Like the adobe in the heat, like the cottonwood coming through the window in the morning, like coffee. It had gotten into the house and made itself at home. We ate, we talked some. I told her about the north fence, what still needed doing, and she said she'd help. I showed her on a piece of paper the line of it, and she said she thought the eastern section was too close to the dry creek bed, that a good rain would pull it. I looked at where she was pointing, and she was right. Custies had been telling me that for 2 years. I said I'd move it. She said, "I know you will." Later, after we'd washed up and she'd gone to bed, I came and stood at the doorway. The lamp was turned very low. She was on her side, face toward the window, not asleep yet. Her back was to me, and I could see, above the collar of her sleep shirt, the edge of the scarring. The cross. It had healed clean, the way Pruitt had said, the raised skin pale against the darker, and the shape unmistakable. I stood there and I thought about the man who'd put it there. I thought about Caswell's file and the record that existed now, her name in it, in writing for a good reason. I thought about Thorpe and the slow accumulation of things that might move against him, imperfect and uncertain. I thought about Mace in a cell in Tucson. And then I thought about something else, about what the mark had been meant to do and what it had actually done. He'd meant it as a brand, I think, a mark of ownership, of warning, of diminishment. A sign she belonged to something that had power over her. She'd walked 40 miles with it and come to my corral and refused to be smaller. I knelt, not beside the bed this time, just in the doorway, in the strip of dark between the main room and the bedroom, my knees on the floorboards and my hands in my lap, and the low lamp throwing its light across the room. I didn't say anything, not even in my head. I just stayed. She turned over. I don't know if she heard me or just felt the change in the room. She turned over and looked at me across the dim space, and her face in the lamplight was soft the way it was when she was at rest, the watchfulness down, the deciding set aside for the night. She said, "Come in or stay out there. Don't kneel in the door." I almost laughed. I got up. I went in and pulled the chair close and sat in it. She turned back toward the window. I sat there in the near dark, in the lamplight, In the house I'd built 11 years ago for a woman who didn't come, with a woman who had. After a while her breathing changed and she slept. I stayed. The lamp sputtered once, same as that first night, and I waited to see if it would catch. It caught, and